Hello and welcome guys back to the channel. This is another Rings of Power episodic review. We're now on episode 4, which is called The Great Wave. It's the great wave of shit, guys. It's fucking, honestly, I'm going to go straight into it. I'm ranting. They're royally fucking this show up, and there's a multitude of reasons why. But this is the worst episode so far, and in my humble opinion, the show is getting worse, not better, unfortunately. House of the Dragon seems to be peaking right now. It seems to be getting better and better and better as it goes on. This show, on the other hand, is royally sinking, and it's one of my all-time favourite, if not my all-time favourite franchise of all time. And you're fucking it. Amazon, you're screwing it. The budget doesn't mean nothing. And I'm just, I'm fuming, guys. They're ruining it. So it begins. But anyway, this is my full breakdown of the episode. I will be talking about heavy plot spoilers for the episode. So if you haven't seen it yet, you're not missing much. But come back at a later time and just be aware that this is going to contain heavy spoilers. We start off the show with what appears to be a christening of a young baby Alarian, which we know who Alarian is. I didn't clock at this point that it was going back in time. I completely dismissed the name Alarian, and this just goes to show really how shit these characters are. I don't care about any of them. I struggle to remember their names half the time, and it's not because they've got long names. I'm a huge fan of fantasy lore. I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, the books, the Silmarillion. You know, I'm a massive Lord of the Rings fan. And I do not struggle with the names. I do not struggle with the places. But the difference with that is, with that, I actually care about the names. I care about the characters. I care about the people. With this show, I couldn't give a shit about any of them. There's only a couple, maybe 2, 3 at a push, that I could really say I genuinely have emotion towards. Like, I want them to go off on a good story arc. I want their characters to evolve. But other than that, I couldn't give a monkeys. And when you've got a show of this magnitude, with this amount of budget, and it's carrying the Lord of the Rings banner behind it, you have to deliver. And currently, Amazon, you are not delivering. You are screwing us up. So anyway, the opening scene is we get a baby christening. It's Alarium. The Queen sort of sees a bit of shaking, a bit of noise within the throne room, and then she sees what is classed as the Great Wave, the tsunami coming at her. Now, I thought we were going to end the episode with the Great Wave. As those of you may or may not know, Numenor, spoilers, goes underwater eventually. Based on the lore, based on the books, there's a divide between beliefs, and we kind of see this in this episode where the Queen is trying to hold on to the newer and truer ways of thinking, i.e. not the way of the elves. And she tries to dismiss them all together. She tries to basically say that we're better off on our own. And Galadriel is there saying, the only way we can overcome Sauron is if we unite. You have to unite the old houses under one banner. Bring back the old alliance between elves and men, which the Queen is against. And we don't really understand why until later on in the episode, where she essentially says that it's because there's different ways of thinking now. And if she goes back to the old ways where they unite with the elves, she's afraid there's going to be an uprising, basically a rebellion, and the city will just collapse. But in the face of, I would imagine, a tsunami, a natural disaster, and she's foreseen this herself, you'd like to think maybe if they just join with the elves, it will save the city. Fuck the belief of the city. Fuck the belief of what people think elves are good or bad. They're going to be alive. They're going to have breath in their body. They're going to have the ability to think and form their own beliefs. Surely you'd think that's better than just having to swallow their pride and get along with the elves. But anyway, I digress. So we go back to the Queen. She's having this vision of Numenor sinking, literally sinking. This massive tsunami wave comes, wipes out all the buildings. And we then go to a blacksmith who is talking like a bit of a sermon in the square amongst the Numenorian people, and he's saying that a lot of the work that's going on in the city has now been taken over by elves. A lot of the trade is being picked up by elves, and they're losing their jobs and they're taking their jobs basically. The councillor, who is kind of like the advisor to the Queen, steps in. Again, can't remember his name, couldn't give a shit either. And he says, no, we're men of Numenor. We're the heirs to a great house. You know, we wear these gold clasps, and you're all stood here whining like children. And what actually matters is our pride. And it's just a really shit scene. And he basically says that they're going to remain as a kingdom of men, that they're going to stay stubborn, but not let the past rule their future. They're not going to let what relationship they did have with the elves and how it crumbled tarnish the way that they're going to run their own kingdom, basically. Moves on very quickly to Galadriel, talking to the Queen, and she's trying to plead to the Queen, and she basically says, the guy that you've got in your custody, i.e. Helbrand, is actually the heir to the Southlands. He's an old king, and what you need to do is release him. You need to get him on side with us. I'll go home. I'll bring back my my homeboys, i.e. Gil-galad and Elrond, and we'll come back with an army. You can bring your Númenóreans, and then we're going to wipe out Sauron. We're going to hit him at the source. We're going to end it now, because he's going to be the ultimate threat. The Queen's not having it. She says there's a lot more to deal with. There's a lot more at hand that you don't even know about. Again, we don't really know what she's talking about at this stage. Galadriel's just pleading with the Queen, just basically saying, you're an idiot, I'm right, you're wrong. And the irony as well in this episode is annoying, because you've got on one hand Galadriel saying, we need to reform our houses, let's let the past die, we're different people now. And actually the Queen's like, no, I haven't forgotten, I'm doing it for what's right for my people. They always say that the elves are stubborn and they don't listen and this, that and the other. And Galadriel, instead of going in with the harmonious approach that we absolutely know Galadriel to be for and recognise her for, and what she appears to be going through in terms of a character arc in the last 3 episodes at least, she completely goes 180, calls the Queen out and says, you're just a consort, you're nothing, let me speak to the King, you've got no authority. And I'm like, well, why did you even bother speaking to her in the first place? Why didn't you just ask, or demand, if you're going down the demanding route, to speak to the King? And that's another thing, guys, that's really pissing me off about this show. I don't like the way they're portraying Galadriel. At this point in the lore, as it is in the series, not the books, don't get me twisted on the books, because they're going completely off piece in terms of the lore of the books. Time scales and stuff's jumping all over the place. As they're portraying her in the series, she's coming across like they're trying to push down this strong feminist lead, and I get it. I absolutely get it. Galadriel is the one to show that strong feminine lead. I get it. But I'm not buying it, because the way that they're delivering her character, in terms of the dialogue, her interactions with other people, she comes across like a stubborn bitch. She just doesn't... She doesn't bargain. She doesn't convince. She doesn't pure... she's not pure of heart. She just basically says, you need to do what you need to do. I'm not here to tell you what you need to do, but I'm going to tell you what you need to do. It's kind of like a Boris Johnson speech. She's coming in here saying, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, but you're going to do it. I'm not going to force you, but you will do it. It's kind of like that, and it doesn't feel right, especially for a character like Galadriel, which at this point in the books is older than the fucking sun, by the way, older than the sun, so she should be wise, she should be intelligent. She's also, by the way, at this point practicing chaos spells, absolute chaos spells. Imagine a warlock of about 6,000 light in Destiny. That's kind of what Galadriel is at this point. So I don't know why they've stripped her of her power and why they've stripped her of her persona. She's an understanding, relatable, of all the elves, like even dwarves who are stubborn as fuck, right? Known to be absolutely stubborn, look up to Galadriel. Look at how Gimli in Lord of the Rings is when he meets Galadriel. It's like he's met an angel. He never speaks to anyone like that. He absolutely kisses her feet, and it's not through power and it's not through fear. People look up to Galadriel because she is hope. She is the essence of hope. She's the essence of light. People hear about her, how beautiful she is, how elegant she is, how accustomed she is to all races within Middle-earth. She is like the angel on Earth, basically. But in this series, they're making her out to be some spoilt teenager who literally stamps her feet if she doesn't get her way, first of all. And the whole scene where she says to the Queen, I want to speak to the King, I'm going to speak to the King then, because you're not listening to me, is like, well, that's not what Galadriel would do. It's completely against her character. And I'm telling you now, if they get Galadriel's power unlocked by when she puts on that elven ring, I swear to God, I'm done with this fucking show. I am done with it. I am not standing for that shit. At this point, Galadriel should be very much a fucking necromancer. She should be a sorceress at least, casting spells, using magic. We haven't seen her use one sniff of magic. And don't tell me it's down to the budget, because there's no budget and all that shit. This show costs multiple billions, with a B, billions of pounds. So don't tell me that you can't put that in the budget, because fuck you. I'd rather have a shittier costume, but actually get something that's true to Galadriel's character. But anyway, we go off piste. That's Galadriel in a nutshell, and why I'm not liking it, and why I didn't like it, especially in this episode. I gave it a chance in the last 3. I thought maybe it's going to go down a certain route after she meets a certain person, or the way that she approaches a certain situation. It might change. She might sort of switch her character. It also goes against what her brother told her in the very first episode about a rock sinking to the bottom of the sea, but a ship sails, a ship floats, and it's all about hope and what you see in people, and she's completely going against it. She's literally going out for revenge. She's doing a Batman year 1, year 2. I'm going to break some arms, I'm going to break some legs, because yes, I want to be the image of fear, but I want people to know that I'm not fucking about, and I want to claim my own vengeance. And that is not Galadriel, guys. It's not. It's absolutely against her character. But anyway, going back to the... Can you tell I'm passionate about this? Going back to the episode breakdown. So we move away from Galadriel. She basically says, I want to speak to the king. Gives the fees up to the queen consort and says, you've got no power. We then jump back to Isildur, where yet again we get that very fucking annoying bit where he's on the boat and you hear Isildur, Isildur in the background. He's looking at the sun like, fuck, what the hell's that? Is that you, Andrew Tate? Like, I don't know. And he's just looking out to the sunrise. There's no real... I don't know why they're doing it. Is it just because he hears a lot of the voices that he speaks to when he's in Lord of the Rings? I don't know. I know there's a bit of backstory in terms of Isildur being the heir, Isildur being the one that's sort of pulled out by certain spirits, which I won't spoil because that might be something that comes out in future episodes. But even if it is, it's being delivered badly, in my opinion. We then get a scene where he kind of gives in to that voice that's calling out to him, and he purposely undoes a rope on the ship. And it causes like the sail to just fly off, and then 2 of his crewmates dive onto it, grab the rope, stop it from going overboard, and then the captain comes over and says, what's going on here? And Isildur says, it was my fault, I didn't tie the rope properly. The captain doesn't buy it and says, you're off of the crew, I've seen you tie that 100 times and you never make a mistake, so you did that on purpose, so you're out. And then because his 2 mates dived on as well, he throws those 2 out as well and says, you're off of the crew, basically. We then cut to Arondir and Adar, and I'm like, yes, here we go. We're going to find out, is Adar Sauron? What's his agenda? I love the aesthetic of Sauron, if this is Sauron, by the way, in these scenes. Kind of looks like the Sauron from the Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor games, the Middle-earth games, where you've got Celebrimbor in there and the Ranger Talion, which is obviously completely non-canon. But I like the aesthetic. It reminds me of the Sauron that you see in those games. And I'm like, yes, here he is, Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He's coming in like an elf. He's going to present himself all calm and collective, but there's going to be elements of evil in there. We don't get that, unfortunately. We see a very weird, but I think it kind of is either going to lend itself to how Sauron approaches people in future episodes, or he genuinely cares about orcs. But basically, there's an orc that's dying of his wounds. Sauron, we assume is Sauron, Adar, puts his hand on the orc and says, you know, it's okay. And the orc's like, Adar, Adar, which means father in Elvish or some sort of language. Kind of shows the orc mercy. He gets visibly upset about the fact that the orc's dying. And in a way, I'm thinking, Sauron doesn't give a shit about his orcs. Like, he made those orcs out of people, basically tortured elves, twisted them into becoming mutilated, fashioned machines of war, which is where the orcs and the Uruk-hai idea come from. But I'm just thinking, Sauron would not give a fuck about an orc. But if they're going down the route where he does, I hope it goes somewhere. I hope this is a seed where it's going to go somewhere. But unfortunately, guys, I've seen a lot of seeds planted in the last 3 episodes, and a lot of them have come to fruition in this episode, and it's not good. I didn't like it. I didn't like the way they went with it. The delivery of it as well was really bad. But anyway, we get this scene where Adar's really caring for this orc. He shanks him in the neck and basically puts him out of his misery because he's suffering and he's in pain. We then get Arondir and Adar face to face, and he asks Arondir who he is and where you were born. He talks about the parting of the sea, talks about I think it's Bellerond, or you know, somewhere Barondir, somewhere like that. It's basically the opening of the sea. And he also asks Adar back, why do the orcs call you father? And he talks about a power, about how he can convince people that he's a god and stuff like that, but he's not quite a god yet, and there's a hint that he's looking to raise his status and raise his power. And at this point I'm thinking, yes, this is Sauron. He's talking about manipulation, he's talking about controlling people, making them believe that he is a god when actually he's not, but he's actually so invested in himself and he's so corrupted by himself and his own greed that he is also assured by himself that he will become as good as a god or a lord. So it screams Sauron, it screams his belief. And I thought that line in particular was quite good, it makes sense. But I don't understand the whole caring for the orc bit, but hopefully it'll make sense in a future episode, but who knows. We then jump to Theo, the young boy. If you've been listening and watching the last few episodes, he was the young boy who took the what looks like a hilt or like a beacon of some sort, but it's like sort of black magic, voodoo, Sauron type vibes. He stowed that in his bag, and now he's arrived at a village with his mum. They're talking to the village owner about suffering, basically, because there's not enough rations to go around. He puts like 4 potatoes on the table and says, is that it? What are we going to do? We're going to have to ration it. And then the guy's like, I'm not rationing it. I rationed the last lot and, you know, I'm starving. And then Theo suggests that they go into the local village or the next village over and try and salvage some food and try and salvage some supplies. And they're all against that because they know the orcs are within sniffing distance. And Theo suggests that they do it under cover of sunlight because, as we know, orcs cannot travel in the sunlight. They cannot be out in the sunlight. They kind of melt away like witches. It burns their skin and they're just not fit for the sunshine, basically. A bit like me. And they're just completely against it. And Theo's like, oh, you know, let me have a go. And they're like, no, we're not going to do it. So he does it anyway. Behind the scenes, he pulls one friend to the side. We don't actually see it, but he pulls a friend to the side or someone that's in the village with him and says, let's go and do it. So they both travel out to the village. We then see a scene where Theo's going through a barn. He's starting to sweep up some of the wheat into a sack that's been knocked over. And then the friend who's outside by the cart, who's waiting for Theo to come out, notices that the sun gets blocked out almost instantly. Everything goes a little bit spooky and he does a runner. Leaves Theo in the barn, still scooping up his oats or whatever he's scooping up. Theo notices something's wrong, has a little look around, and is like, oh shit, what's going on? Senses that there's something in there with him, and he gets attacked by an orc. So the orc slashes his arm and basically wants to eat him at first. He says, oh, young blood, and tastes the blood off of the blade and says, oh, young blood. Tries to kill Theo, basically, and use him as hot dog meat. Theo gives up a bit of a fight. He then pulls out the artifact, or the hilt. It then turns into what looks like a blade of Morgoth. If you guys remember from The Lord of the Rings, where the Witch King stabs Frodo with a Morgul blade and then the blade disappears, but the hilt still stays there. Kind of looks a lot like that. So I'm thinking, is Theo going to become one of the Nazgul? Is he going to become one of the 9? He could become the Witch King, who knows? Because he's very, very much attached to this hilt. He's very invested in it and he can't quite understand why. He's obviously going to be easily corrupted because he's quite young, he's quite influential, and he just feels drawn to it. So, and the hilt, oddly, seems to respond quite well to him. It tends to work with his power. It's also making him quite abrupt, quite angry with his mum. It's making him quite decisive and almost cocky, which is traits, obviously, of Sauron. It's traits of Sauron's greed, and it's kind of feeding into that as well. So I'd be very interested to see how they deliver this character arc for Theo. It might go absolutely nowhere, but I'm hoping he will become one of the nine maybe. He's now tainted by the black magic of Sauron. He's got the mark of Sauron on his arm as well. So it gives the kind of impression that he might actually lead one of those types of cults, so those types of groups. He might become a soldier of Harad. He might be, as I said, he might become one of the Black Númenóreans. He might be at the mouth of Sauron. It might become the Witch King. He might become one of the nine Nazgûl. Who knows? Who knows? But at this point, it seems to be going in that sort of way. He's becoming more and more obsessed with this thing. He cannot let it go. He carries it everywhere with him. And he's keeping it a secret as well, not only from himself almost, but from his mum. He's not telling anyone about it. He's not saying what it is, what it does, but he's also dependent on it as well. Very much like how the One Ring works with Isildur, Bilbo, Smeagol, all that kind of stuff, Frodo. So it's going down that route. But anyway, we have a little bit of a showdown. He gets away, he hides in a well. Orc can't find him, and then the orc basically gives commands to the other orcs that are with him and says, raid the village, we've got to find that hilt, we've got to find that artifact. So they go ransacking it, and all this time Theo just hid in the well. We then cut to the scene where Elrond is with Celebrimbor, and in the background you can see that there is a forge being built behind them in the Misty Mountains where the dwarves are. Celebrimbor and Elrond are having a bit of a chat, and they basically say that Durin is hiding something as he's avoiding going to speak to Celebrimbor. He hasn't seen him in days, and he senses something's off. So Elrond goes to speak to Durin, who, funny enough, isn't there. Bumps into his wife. They have a bit of a weird interaction, but ultimately Elrond notices that his smithing axe is still there, and also his wife is cooking Durin his favourite meal. So Elrond then says if he's going on an expedition in a chasm that's supposed to be 2 days down, basically, why is his great smithing axe still on the wall, and why are you cooking his favourite meal? It sounds like he's not far away. The wife then sort of says, oh no, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, he's taken a different axe with him. It's a really stupid interaction, but she basically says he's taken a different axe with him. He's gone on a little bit of an expedition with a group of people, but he is doing what you've told him to do. This is Elrond, guys. He's not stupid. He's going to figure this out. He's got the gift of foresight, and that's exactly what we see. The next scene, Elrond sort of stood on a bridge in Khazad-dûm. He's overlooking the archway, if you like, that connects the two main bridges, and he can overhear and he can oversee Durin talking to his wife, and then they basically openly to each other say that Elrond's onto him. He knows there's something up. So Durin basically says, just keep him busy, you know, thank you for being true to me, thank you for not telling him. And we get the sense that he's on a little bit of a secret expedition. I didn't quite know what was going on at this point until the next scene where Elrond kind of foresees and overhears that Durin's going into another area within the mine. He's still mining down, but he's going into another area, and it gives the impression that he's found something that's quite precious, that's quite, you know, important to the dwarves as a race. And straight away I thought of Mithril, because of that time when you see Gimli going through the mines of Moria, and when Frodo gets pierced by the troll's spear, and everyone thinks he's dead. He shows the Mithril vest that Bilbo has given him from the trek to the Misty Mountains, which is part of the hoard, you know, the treasure hoard that they find. And Gimli's kind of like, Mithril, you know, and he's kind of mesmerized by it. He's never really seen it. He's just heard, obviously, folk tales about it. And it's the most precious metal in the world, and it's found by the dwarves. And straight away I thought, this must be what Durin finds, and this is what they forge some of the greatest weapons in Middle-earth in, some of the greatest armor, some of the greatest jewels. And Elrond kind of senses that there's something going on. So anyway, that's that scene. We then jump to Galadriel, who is now in prison because she spoke out against the Queen, and she had the guards put her in prison, basically. Hellbrand, who I firmly now believe is Sauron. I don't know who Adar is. It could be Sauron in different forms. As we know from the lore, Sauron can take many shapes, many forms, and Gandalf says it quite a lot in the books and in the movies. The enemy takes many shapes, has many spies, many servants in his sort of service. So it could be someone that is connected to Sauron, but I'm pretty confident Hellbrand is either Sauron directly in the disguise of an old king, which is why he's so hell-bent against going back, because everyone's going to say, who the fuck's this guy? That's not our king. Or I've seen a lot of theories online that it could be the King of the Dead. So the one that Aragorn goes to and says, you know, you swore fealty to my people, but you turned them away, and Isildur's cursed you now to hide into this mountain. And Aragorn obviously calls upon them in the end, and that forms the army of the dead in the Return of the King. It could be that. He could be a Nazgul, I don't know, but it seems to lean towards Sauron. And the only way I say that, and the reason I say it, is because in this scene, Halbrand talks to Galadriel a lot about tactics. He seems to show a lot of deep intelligence as well. And also, the one thing I picked up on, and I thought, this is Sauron, he says a lot about mastering the enemy, using whatever means necessary, i.e. deceit. He basically says, if you want to get what you want to get to, and create what you need, then when you speak to the Queen, tell her what she wants to hear. Sweet talk her, basically deceive her, get her on side, and then you can show her the ways of how you want it to be. That is Sauron in the making. That is absolutely how Sauron has so many followers. It's the same tactics that Morgoth used as well. And as we know, Sauron starts off as Anatar, the lovely, beautiful appearing elf who goes around making nice artifacts for people. But obviously, as we know, the elves are the only ones that don't buy it. And they obviously make their own rings secretly and all that kind of stuff. And then it carries on from there. So I think we're going to see that, but a lot later on. And also why I think Halbrand is Sauron is because he's very interested in smithing. He's interested in how the Númenóreans make metals. And I think he wants to craft a ring at this point, or he wants to craft something that's going to create more power for him, something that he can pour his soul into, something that can sustain him even in death. So as we know, he does eventually master that ability, and he does create the One Ring for himself. So to me, it makes sense that it's Sauron, because Halbrand's spending a lot of time with people in Númenor. These are among the best smiths, you know, in the world and in history. He's learning a lot about how they make things. He's learning a lot about what he needs to do. If you watch the last episode, he spoke to that blacksmith about how he can get involved in being a Númenórean smith and how to use the anvils and stuff like that. But also he's given Galadriel tactics on how to manage people and how to essentially deceive people into doing what you want them to do. That is Sauron to a T, so I think it is him. We then get a scene where the guards appear at the cell, and they relay the message to Galadriel that the Queen Regent has advised that she needs to be shipped back to the elves under armed supervision. As they open the gate and they go to take her away, she somehow, these are 4 Númenórean guards by the way, she somehow disarms the main one who goes to put the cuffs on her, throws him into the jail. The other 3 go to jump on her. She does like some very quick hand movements, blocks, manages to squish them all together and then pushes them all into the cell. Just really, really badly written scene, guys. It just didn't make sense. And I know Galadriel's powerful, but not in the physical sense powerful. She could not overthrow 4 guards physically. Númenórean guards, by the way, who are tall as fuck and strong as fuck. She would not be able to do it. And she manages to do it in this scene. She locks them in. It's a really poorly shot scene. Locks them in there. And then Halbrand sort of laughs at it and says, aha, you know, you got overthrown by a woman, all that sort of thing. She then goes to look for the king. As she walks into the king's bedchamber, she sees the queen sat over the bed with the king, and she notices that the king is very, very ill. I also noticed that the king, in this iteration of the king, looked a lot like Gandalf, and I was like, is that Gandalf? Looked a hell of a lot like Ian McKellen's Gandalf, but it's not, obviously. And she sort of sees why the queen's been acting the way she has. She then apologizes and said, forgive me, I didn't know about his illness. And then she says, why, you know, she pulls her to one side and they have a bit of a heart to heart, and she says, why didn't you follow the ways of the elf? You know, your husband always did. We had a great alliance and all of a sudden it stopped. Why didn't you continue that allegiance? And again, tries to get tries to get the queen on side with Galadriel, form that old alliance and go against Sauron. So already she's listened to what Halbrand said. She's saying to the queen about, oh, you know, your husband's a great man and he created a great bond. And she took no personal pride in that moment, and it was quite a good scene. It linked into the very last scene where Hellbrand is essentially telling her what to do, what to say in order to get what she wants from this. So she uses that to great effect. The Queen then has a real open discussion with her and says, you know, it all changed when he got crowned, when we had his coronation. People then started to rebel, and they associated the elves with the bad, basically, and that the king then didn't know where to put himself. He didn't know whether to almost put his foot down and say, the elves are great, and, you know, they've helped us do this, they've helped us build this city, but he kind of didn't do that. He kind of let the people that wanted to moan, which created a split in differences. He created a split in beliefs in terms of what the Númenóreans wanted, and that's obviously where the different houses are built, why there's so much divide between the true Númenóreans who are still loyal to the elves, and then you've got the Númenóreans who want to be their own city, their own religion, they want to be their own way of thinking, their own way of life. They don't want to be under any elven banner, basically. And the Queen says, you know, that's kind of what happened. She then shows Galadriel one of the seeing stones, the Palantir, and Galadriel puts her hand on it. The Queen warns her and says, you know, this isn't something that you've touched before. Galadriel says, it's cool, I've got this, I've touched a seeing stone before. And the Queen's like, nah, you haven't touched one like this. But anyway, Galadriel does it. She then sees a vision of Númenor getting wiped out by a massive wave, and it obviously leans into the name of this episode. It's the sort of premonition of the fall of Númenor, but also the Great Wave, I think, is the many changes that we see, the many changes that we witness in terms of sort of power, struggle between friends, and things that are starting to build up. This is the wave of change. So it's kind of like leaning into that as well. But she sees the fall of Númenor, and then there's a bit of a debate between her and the Queen in terms of what to do next. Galadriel says that this is what I saw, and I know you've seen it too. And the Queen's like, yeah, I have seen it. And Galadriel's like, what are you going to do about it? We need to do something. Why don't you bring your armies with me? We will go to Middle-earth. And yet again, she hits home that the only real way to survive and, you know, do what's right for the people of Númenor is to strike the darkness and the fear at its core, i.e. Sauron, i.e. Middle-earth. Let's all go over there. The Queen's not really having it, and she says it's too risky. I don't want to cause a massive divide between my people. We won't have a Númenor to defend, sort of thing, if I go against what they want. So she says no. We then cut back to Theo, who is rising from the well. He just witnesses basically the whole village in ashes. Everything's on fire. Orcs are running around, pillaging, raping, stealing, and people's being beaten up and stuff like that. Theo's just about to get smashed by an orc. He comes over and notices that Theo's there. He's just about to kill him, and then he gets a nice little arrow through the back of the head by Arondir, who has just turned up. We then get quite a cool scene. I liked the way that this scene was put together. We get a scene where it's kind of like Amon Hen, where Boromir is trying to defend Merry and Pippin. You get that scene where all the Uruk-hai are running through Amon Sul, and they're trying to go after Boromir and the hobbits, basically. And Boromir stood there on his own, fighting off hundreds of Uruk-hai, and he obviously takes the 3 hours. But it's kind of a similar scene. So Arondir finds Theo and Theo's mum. They're running through the trees. Arondir now and then spins round, fires off a little pop shot, kills one of the orcs that's running at them, but it's all like in slow motion. Music's perfect as well. And we get a scene where they make it out to the edge of the forest, into the open field. Just as the orcs are about to come over, Arondir draws his sword like that, and you get that sense that it's the last stand of Boromir, that epic scene in the Fellowship of the Ring that was delivered beautifully, where Sean Bean stands there like an absolute warrior and fights off the Uruk-hai as best as he can until he cannot stand, basically. But they get captured anyway, as we know. But we get the vibe that it's going down that route. And before it actually goes any further, it's like, yes, this is going to be intense. I thought Arondir was going to die, but the orcs come out of the trees. They're just about to step out into the field, and then they notice that the sun's beaming down. They're getting sizzled, and they can't go any further. The minute they step out into the sun, they die. So they're just kind of stood there, you know, like snarling and growling from within the safety of the trees. And Arondir just puts his sword away, and they walk off. I'm like, oh, that could have been such a great scene. I get it that the orcs can't survive out in the sun, but surely if they're traveling in daylight, they could have done what the other orcs did in the prior episode, where they dug the trenches and made the elves dig all through the trees and stuff like that. They had like cloaks on that protected them from the sun. They could have had them do that. I don't know. Could have had a machine of some sort, like a ballista that was pushed out from the trees that helped them go so far out to fight Arondir. I just think it was a missed opportunity. But anyway, Arondir comes out the hero. He saves Theo, he saves his mum, picks off a few orcs as well with his bow at the same time. And that's it. We then cut to Elrond and Durin. And in a prior scene, basically, Mithril is uncovered, as I mentioned. So we're talking about the Mithril coat. Mithril's uncovered, and Elrond then knows that that's what the dwarves have found. Durin gets him to swear on his father's name, which he does, and says, don't tell anyone about this. This is a very close secret to us. This could pull us out of, you know, all the issues that we've got. This could move our people into the next stage. Everyone's like, yeah, sure, won't say a thing. We then cut to a scene where there's a funeral, and in the prior scene, Durin's kind of runs down a shaft to try and save 4 dwarves that are supposedly stuck. And it looks like there's a rockfall or something within one of the shafts. Elrond says you can't go in there. And Durin's like, no, there's 4 people in there. He runs in after him. And then we just cut to a scene where Durin's wife is like singing. And we get the impression that Durin has died. We get the impression that he's fallen. There's loads of dwarves there stood there in sort of funeral gear. They've all got pyres. They're all like singing, chanting. Elrond looks quite sad, and I'm thinking, shit, they've killed off Durin, that's crazy. But he's not dead. We get a scene where Durin sort of walks up after the funeral, or after the chant that the wife is doing, and actually none of them have died, which is a bit weird why they did the whole thing anyway. But the wife explains that the reason why she's doing the whole chanting and singing is to plead with the orcs that are underground, that whoever's fallen down there dwarf-wise, to spare them if they're still alive and to bring them back to their people in exchange for, I'd imagine, jewels, gems, whatever they want, and do a bit of a trade. But Durin then quickly comes up the shaft and kind of says, everyone's fine, we've saved every last one, so they're all safe. So that kind of dismisses the whole point of the last scene, which is a bit odd. Durin then says that his father has ordered the close of the shaft and he wants everything to cease. They don't want them to dig anymore. And he goes off on one, basically. And Elrond basically calms him down and says, look, I would give anything to be back with my father. We've had disagreements too. But just remember that, you know, even in anger, you should find love, and you should still be able to get on with your father, even if you don't agree, even if you feel angry towards him, even if you have disagreements. And there's quite a touching scene with how Elrond talks about his father and what he would give to see him again and spend another moment with him, instead of looking up at the stars and just seeing that he's there somewhere and he's doing what he needs to do in the Undying Lands. So Durin's quite touched by this, and he then approaches his next scene very differently. But then before we go to that, we cut to Arondir warning Theo's mum and the people of the tower, basically, that they need to swear allegiance to Adar because he's coming for them, and if they don't swear allegiance, they're all dead. We then see Theo kind of sat down by sort of like an outhouse, and then an old guy comes over to him and says, look, I heard of what you did, and chucks him like a little flask of what I assume is ale or a drink, and says, oh, you know, you've earned that, you've done so well, I've heard what you found. And Theo's like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And the old man's like, look, we found the hilt on you when we brought you back here, where we healed you. Don't worry about it. I'm on your team as well. And he kind of pulls up his sleeve and he shows him the mark of Sauron. So this is obviously a cult guy. This is a guy that's completely on board with what Sauron's doing. He's a follower. And he basically says to Theo, I'm just the same as you. I can see you've got the same mark. And you need to get ready. Change is coming. Adar's coming. And Theo kind of talks about, you know, Theo says, what do you mean? And the old guy says, you must have seen the star fall. You must have seen the signs. You must have heard. And then Theo talks about the meteor fall. So I'm hoping the guy, you know, the mystery man, what people are saying is the meteor man, who a lot of people think is Gandalf. I'm hoping that's not Sauron, because whilst I did think it is, it now fits that it's Gandalf. And it fits this series in terms of the story that it's Gandalf. It might take him another turn, but it's all just getting a little bit too silly and a little bit too confusing. So hopefully it'll all make sense in the end and it'll tie up nicely. But the man basically says to Theo, you're one of us. the hilt's going to go to our master, and we're going to find change. We're going to do what we need to do. We've got people coming to help us, and you need to be ready, to Theo, basically. And Theo doesn't quite know what that means, and we're not really told what it's going to mean either. We then go to a final scene. Elendil escorts Galadriel to the boats, and she's kind of looking quite sad and quite annoyed that she couldn't convince the Queen. She gets on the boat, and then we get a scene where the Queen is talking to the council, talking to the people of Numenor, and she notices as she's walking back to the council that white petals start falling off the tree, and she recalls the vision she had about Numenor falling. She recalls the conversation that Galadriel had after she spoke to Helbrand about the old alliance, the old ways. It's not about the elf way or the way of man, it's about the way that worked, the way of love, the way of peace. And she kind of notices and realizes then that Galadriel's actually been speaking quite a sound truth all this time. Regardless of her means and how she did it, she has actually been speaking quite a true way of how to move forward with this. So we then cut to the small chamber room where the Queen's addressing the people, and she says, you each need to decide, you each need to, you know, determine what you're going to do, what our fate's going to be, because I have chosen to align with the old way. And she basically comes out at the end and says, I've brought Galadriel back. And then she comes in, and obviously she didn't get on the boat, or even if she did, as soon as the Queen noticed the white petals falling off of the tree, this triggered her to think differently, and actually to think that Galadriel is actually onto something, and she's telling the truth, and she rekindles the old ways of thinking, and she remembers what it was like, what her father, her husband, used to say to her as well. And then she goes and gets Galadriel and says, come on, we're going to make this work. Let's go and convince the people. So she sides with Galadriel, and then the Queen asks for volunteers. So at this point, she's given freedom to the people to think. You would have thought at this point that based on her husband not going anywhere different and how he managed it, that caused a split. That caused some people to align with the elves, some people to align with that, no, we're Numenor, it's a kingdom of men, and that's it. So you would like to have thought that it would have been difficult to show it in the scene, but with Galadriel's help, it would have been good to show it in a sense of the Queen realising that the old ways is what made Numenor. And actually, with Galadriel's help in that scene, they could have collectively delivered a bit of a speech to the people in a way that doesn't make it sound forceful, and it doesn't make it sound like the old way, but then it, you know, it's delivered in a way that the people realise that they're right, and it's the way that has worked, and it's the reason why they're all stood there today. So, but anyway, all we get is the Queen saying, you need to pick for yourself, which side are you going to be on? We're going to give our soldiers to Galadriel, we're going to give our calls to the people, we're going to sail to Middle-earth, and we're going to help her like the old ways. Who's with me? Who's going to serve? And then you get a few stragglers, some of the old crewmates of Isildur are like, yeah, we'll do it. And then Isildur himself says, I will serve. And then Elendil sort of looks as if to say, what? So either Elendil then in the next episode agrees to serve as well, or he gets granted passage to serve by the Queen because his son's going. I don't know. But either way, that's how it ends, guys. Elendil saying, where you going, Isildur? What's going on? Giving him the look. And Isildur volunteering himself to serve the cause. So that obviously ties in quite nicely with how we know things pan out when we get round to Lord of the Rings. So by the end of the Second Age, where you've got the Battle of the Last Alliance between men, elves against Sauron, this is obviously where you've got Elrond, Gil-galad for the elves, and then you've got Elendil and Isildur for men, and it's Numenor and Noldor, essentially, the elves coming together to fight against the greater cause. So the alliance does get reformed, but this was the start of it, and it's quite a touching moment, and it was quite nice to see how Isildur and Elendil ended up going to Middle-earth, and this is the start of it. So hopefully they're going to build on that, and it's not just they're on a ship in the next episode, they're in Middle-earth, and off we go, let's build up an army. I hope there's going to be a lot more to it than that, but that was a scene I particularly liked. But that's as good as it gets, guys. That is as good as it gets. As I said, I don't like the way Galadriel's being portrayed in this series. I think she's coming across as a spoilt brat. She's coming across as vengeful. She has got hatred in her heart. She's very forceful. She's very demanding. She's not reasonable. She's not approachable. There's very few people who actually stand and listen to her, even her own kin. And I get they're trying to make it like she's you know, the woman that always knew right, but no one's listening to her because she's a woman and stuff like that. But we've had that rammed down our throats, and I'm not against it if it works in the context of what we're watching. So we're watching Lord of the Rings, we're watching the Rings of Power, and for me it doesn't work, especially with Galadriel's character. Absolutely doesn't work at all. As I said, at this point she should be older than the sun, wiser than the sun. She should have all the tricks of the trade, more magic tricks than Dynamo. She should be farting absolute clouds of magic beams, basically. And all we're getting is a girl that's just keen to fight, keen to go to war, and keen to avenge her brother. And it doesn't really sit right. It just feels like we're not watching Lord of the Rings. It feels like we are watching a fantasy series that is lending elements of the lore from Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Silmarillion, all that kind of stuff. Tolkien's lore, basically. But it's shaping its own destiny. It's going in its own little way. And I'm not against them sort of hashing some of the canon, rehashing some of the lore, if it makes sense. And to me, one of the things that doesn't make sense is how Galadriel's character is being portrayed. I've got nothing against the acting. I think the actress is doing a phenomenal job. I think she's a great actress as Galadriel, but the delivery of it and the way that it's written, I blame the writers for this, not the actors. The actors are brilliant, but the writers in this are absolutely atrocious. It's as if you've just had one person sit there and watch one Lord of the Rings film ever and go, yeah, Lord of the Rings, man, I'm a fan. Like, I'm just going to write shit, I'm going to make shit up, and it's like, it doesn't fit anything. But in all honesty, guys, this was the worst episode out of them all so far. Unfortunately, I feel the show's getting worse, not better. I know they've signed off for a couple more seasons at least, so it is going to be slow burn, it is going to be slow building, but I don't mind that. But as long as it's done in an interesting, intriguing way, and it just creates more logical questions rather than, why are we doing this? Who's that character? I didn't care about your relationship with them. Even the whole Arondir trying to get with Theo's mum relationship, it's trying to replace Aragorn and Arwen from Lord of the Rings. We don't need a replacement. We've had that. You can't do it any better than the way it's done. I'm sorry, you can't. So don't try and redo it. Make it your own. Make it your own sort of origin story almost. Make it, I get you got to have a romance and kind of stuff in there, but do something different. You know, go have Isildur with the girl that's trying to talk him out of doing things. You know, build on that a little bit if you have to. But the whole elfin, you know, lady thing's been done to death now. Obviously, it was the other way around. Aragorn was the man in Lord of the Rings, and Arwen was the elf, and it was the elf and the human coming together. Now it's Arondir, the male, as the elf, and then whatever her fucking name is the human coming together. But it's the same shit, but it's less interesting because I don't give a shit about Arondir. I don't give a shit about the Theo's mum. I don't care, you know, what they want, their interactions. They're not relatable characters. Aragorn was an absolutely relatable character. You felt his struggle. You felt his conflict between being the person he wants to be and being part of his old lineage, coming into being king, serving his heir, basically, serving his dad, Arathorn, and doing what's right. But I don't give a shit about any of these characters, and that is a problem. That is a real problem. I like Elrond's character. I like where it's going. I like some of his dialogue and the way he presents himself. I feel that the character, obviously it's young Ned Stark that plays him. He's done his research. He's looked at Hugo Weaving's character, especially because even like some of the mannerisms, the way he stands and the way he delivers some of the dialogue, and even his tone and pace within his own speech is very much reflective of Hugo Weaving, and I like that. It's kind of a nod and respect a little bit to how Elrond's character was delivered in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So Elrond's character I like. I love Durin's character. My man right here. Durin's character is one of my favourites. I think he's playing the role absolutely brilliantly. True to the lore as well. True to dwarf, dwarf history, as we know what the dwarves are like. Quite greedy, quite stubborn. But also they've got a heart of gold, and all they care about is gems, in all honesty. And that's kind of, even with Elrond, how good of a relationship they've got. Even with Elrond, he was very shady at first about showing him the mithril and trying to sort of keep it for himself. And as the old saying goes, the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep, and they awoke the darkness in Khazad-dûm, which is the Balrog. So I hope we get to see that as well. I hope they continue to dig, get all the mithril, go so far down, and then all of a sudden, kabang, we get a little Balrog that comes up and wipes out Khazad-dûm. I hope that's what happens. But yeah, character-wise, it's flat as a witch's tit, guys. There's no one in this show that I think is absolutely smashing home. And the difficulty as well is that when you've got the House of the Dragon running alongside this, and you've got so many diverse and interesting characters, you've got Viserys, Rhaenyra, you've got Daemon, even Otto, the Hand of the King. I'm like, shit. You had the Crab Feeder. You know, there's so many characters that bring so much to that series. Not just in terms of how they're acting it out, but the characters themselves are beautifully written. They're diverse, they're original. They've got their own agenda. They're interesting. They've got unique names as well. They've got nice long-winded names, but I remember every single one of them because my emotion when I'm watching it in that hour, those 40 minutes, is absolutely locked into what's going on. But it's off in this show. It is off. I hope it changes and I hope it picks up, but it's off. The only thing really, really excellent about this show, and continues to be excellent, is the cinematography. The way that the scenes are put together, the CGI, the swooping shots of the landscape, the fight scenes, mostly, are all really, really good. But again, when you've got a budget of billions of pounds, it should be a given. We shouldn't be praising it just on that. But because you've got a budget of billions and billions of pounds, I should hope and I should think that you're going to have epic scale costumes, cinematography, lighting, scenery, the way that the camera swoops in. It should feel like a movie, and it does in that respect. But in terms of how the characters are developing, the story itself, the stupid little scenes that we keep getting where Galadriel manages to overcome 4 Númenórean guards, throw them into the cell, is like, what? And the problem is, I think because there's so many Tolkien fans out there like myself that have read the books, that know the lore, I think you will find this a worse experience. If you've not read any of the books, you don't really pay much attention to the movies in terms of what's going on, you're just taking in the fantasy, you're just taking in the battles, I think you'll praise this, I think you'll enjoy it. But as a Lord of the Rings banner, as a show that's got the Lord of the Rings banner on it, you cannot come in saying that you're a Lord of the Rings show and absolutely piss on the lore. You're going all over the shop with it. And I don't mind that. I don't mind them going down a different route to the lore. It's interesting. They should be doing it. We don't want a carbon copy, but the lore's there for a reason. And if you're going to build a show based on the creation of the Great Rings and the Ring of Power, the One Ring, you have to stay true to the lore somehow. You have to stick to some of the roots. You have to stick to how the characters are. But they're completely rebranding these characters. They're coming out with all sorts of stuff, and it's not flying with me. It's not working. It's different if the dynamic worked, if all the characters pieced together, their story arcs made sense, the time jumping wasn't all over the place, and we're missing huge events within this timeline as well, and we're focusing on shit, to me, that doesn't really matter. And it feels like it's building up to something that's not going to matter in the end either. So, shit episode, guys. Sack it off. I'm praying as a Lord of the Rings fan that this picks up. But when you've got this running alongside House of the Dragon, and you see how well House of the Dragon is going, I can't help but compare the two. Especially when you've got one that comes out on Monday, one that comes out on Friday. You've got very little time in between the two episodes, so you're literally comparing them side by side. And House of the Dragon is pissing all over this show massively. Less of a budget. But again, they stuck to the script. They stuck to the lore. They're using these characters and they're fleshing out events that we already know about. And this is what they should have done with this show. If they would have done that, it would have been a more wholesome experience. I'm not asking for, you know, time jumps and all that kind of stuff, but focus on the characters themselves. Stay true-ish to their arcs. Stay true-ish to their story and just flesh it out. Go wild a little bit with the imagination within the trueness of that story. But the more you defer away from the lore, the more you defer away from the context, the more you just get a show about fantasy with the Lord of the Rings banner on it, and it just feels shit. It just feels like a cheap knockoff version of what we know and love, unfortunately, at the minute. So for me, guys, if I was to give this episode a rating, sadly, it's a 4 out of 10. It's below average, it's below par. And even if I strip back the whole Lord of the Rings visage and just look at it as a show about fantasy, about, you know, building up drama, building up the characters, the plot itself, nothing really happens in this episode. Nothing substantial really happens. You get Galadriel bitching about how the elves should be king, and blah, 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 we gave you all this land. We get Durin finds Mithril, yeah, that's great, and then you just get that little shit Theo is just holding onto a hilt. He doesn't really understand why he's holding onto it. We don't see much interaction from Adar either. He's just kind of like skulking about and, yes, we're going to do this. Ugh. We don't really get a sense of who he is, and there might be a reason for that later on, but all of it just feels flat. I was looking forward to this one because we were going to see Adar. How is Galadriel going to pull the queen across to doing what she needs to do? Are we going to witness the fall of Numenor, especially when we got the image of all the waves coming in at the beginning? I thought, yes, what a way to end this episode if it ends with the fall of Numenor. I know that's going to be a huge time jump, but I'd rather see that and understand, like, through the way that the scenes are delivered, that there has been a time jump and it's okay. But if it's delivered excellently, then happy days, I can take it. But we, like I said, we just seem to be getting fleshed out scenes for the sake of fleshing out scenes, and nothing ever happens in those scenes. We just get a shit piece of dialogue and no character development, no story development, and you just think, but what was the point in that prior episode then? You've just blown it to pieces. So the writing on this one, guys, unfortunately, is making me very, very worried. The other episodes were quite good. There were elements of the other episodes that I absolutely loved as well, not just as a Lord of the Rings fanboy, but just as a fan of fantasy TV, fantasy stories. I really enjoyed some of the other episodes, aspects of them at least, but I just feel it's getting worse and worse. And this, unfortunately, I hope is not the first step in a downward slope. I hope this is not a sign of things to come. I hope they turn it around. I hope this was just a shit, fuller, stupidly written episode that picks up again in episode 5, hopefully. But it's a 4 out of 10 from me, guys. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm being too harsh. What did you enjoy about the show this week around? Or did you feel exactly the same as me and feel that it was a write-off? I can't help but compare it to House of the Dragon, and I can't help but feel that this one is well and truly being left in the dust. House of the Dragon is getting better. This one is absolutely nosediving. And as a fan of this franchise, I want it to do well. I want it to succeed. But I always get this worry about, oh my god, please don't fuck it up. Imagine if that's going to be really bad. They did it with the Resident Evil series on Netflix. I just had a very horrible feeling through watching the trailer that it was going to nosedive, and it did. And I've got the same feeling about this. All my friends have been asking me, building up to this coming out, what do you think of Rings of Power? What do you think of it? And I liked the look of the trailer. I didn't ever dispute the cinematography, the way it was presented. But I was always afraid about how they would deliver the characters, how they would deliver the lore, how they would deliver the story. And now my fears are coming to reality, unfortunately. So hopefully it's just for this one episode. I can take a kick in the balls for one episode, but I can't take it for the rest of the series. I will be pissed off. So it's a 4 out of 10 for me. I didn't enjoy it, but let me know in the comments, guys. Did you like it? Is there anything about it that you think I've missed? Or do you completely agree and feel that this one is taking a bad turn for the worse? Until next week, hopefully it gets better. As a fan, I want it to. Let me know in the comments what you think either way. If you did enjoy this review, please do leave a thumbs up as well, and consider subscribing to the channel if you are brand new to the scene. Until next week, guys, I'm praying and hoping it will get better. I'm praying. I'm going to cry if it doesn't. Until next week, guys, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.